Hello everyone, welcome back into the studio for more Young Slave by Michelangelo. We're continuing on from last time with the block-in of this figure. For those new viewers here, this is a small-scale master study of Michelangelo's Young Slave sculpture that we're doing in Chavant NSP medium oil-based clay. Let's get into it. We're mainly focused on the front view last time around, since that was where the reference was taken from mainly. The sculpture itself is of course unfinished on the back, the actual sculpture that is, and some of the sides are also unfinished, and this means we have to infer some things about the sculpture from the information we can find on the front of our reference. This is not really too great of a problem if we have a little bit of knowledge about the human body and how it goes together. For example, we know where the pit of the neck is, or the sternal notch where your collarbones meet, and from this knowledge we can easily, or rather easily, guess where the top of the rib cage in the back should be, also known as the C7. Knowing the position of the arms will give us the likely placement of the scapulas, of course. These two work in unison, and as the arms move, the scapula moves with them. When the arm is rotated up above the head, like the left arm is here, the scapula is going to rotate and move away from the center line, sort of slide along the side of the body. The scapula often being part of the contour from the side makes this of course very important. The position of the arm impacts the contours from the side a great deal. Even though we have no reference with the scapula visible, we can infer where it needs to be or should be based on the position of the arm. Notice too that I'm often working both contours at the same time, meaning that from the side, for example, I'm working on both the front and the back contours. Or at least that's what I should be doing. They need to play together, and if too much attention is placed towards one, then issues tend to arise. There is of course an overall width we're meant to get to. As both contours extend out from the armature, there is a point in space where we've reached the borders of our figure, and the figure is as wide as it needs to be from any given view. These borders need to exist on both sides of the figure, of course, and if they don't, let's say they only exist or mostly exist on one side of the figure because you put all of your attention to working on the back, for example, and then neglected the front, then we'll tend to overbuild that one side to create the sense of the full width. Working both sides at the same time is the best way to avoid issues like this, and the best way to keep the visual impression fairly solid as you struggle through the process of building contours up to final widths. In places where the work has progressed less, like the back, as opposed to places where the work has progressed more, like the front, you will see a clear difference in the separation of forms. The areas with less progress are going to have more depth between the forms. There is going to be more air and space between the forms that we're establishing. Slowly this will be taken away as we add more clay, but it's a nice feature to have present in your work early on in the process. A tendency amongst most of us is to add too much volume too soon, and this makes reworking the sculpture and making subtle adjustments to it much harder. We end up having to sculpt in a rake and pray kind of way, which is something that we came up with, which is not good and not conducive to creating and controlling the end result. Control is really key in representational sculpture, of course, because without control you might just end up somewhere or with something you didn't intend, and perhaps somewhere where the representation of your subject is so false that it can no longer be said to represent your subject, which, considering we are doing representational art, would then, I think, be considered a failure. A big feature often neglected when it comes to sculpture is structure. It's easy to set up in the beginning, and it's why we start with the internal bony masses of the body, the box and the egg, and make sure they are sculpted symmetrically and with a plausible center line traveling through them. You would have seen all of that in part 1 of this video series. Especially in complex poses like this one, it's easy to let the structure slip as the work proceeds. When I get the front view or the back view, which is from where we observe structure, because that's where you can see symmetry in the bony masses, of course. The bony masses are not symmetrical from the side views. When I get the front or the back view, I always like to control and make sure that the work has maintained a sense of structure and that it hasn't become lost in my pursuit of everything else, the stuff that's going to make the figure look cool, essentially. None of that stuff, the stuff that everybody likes to pay attention to, and that seems much more complex and fun, none of that stuff matters if the ribcage is asymmetrical or if the center line bends inside the ribcage in a way that makes the figure look like it's made out of rubber. I run through these structural checkups, if you will, for about 5 minutes at the beginning of every session from the front and the back. This makes sure that I'm still on the right track, which is very important. I check symmetry within the bony masses of the body, right to left symmetry that is. I check that they are not bent from top to bottom, of course. And I check that the center line meant to represent the spine can connect the two in a way that's anatomically plausible. And again, we discussed what the spine can do and can't do in part 1 of this series. By establishing the contours from the side view first here, I have the borders to work within in terms of depth from the back view. I know that everything that happens from the back view needs to exist within the borders established from the side. And if the borders or contours from the side are well established, meaning accurately established, I shouldn't have issues with things like creating the right amount of contrast and drama when working within them from the back. Very often, I'll hear complaints about how students think their work is flat when observing from the back, for example, or that it's boring or it doesn't look right, and we always tell them to check the contours from the side because this is the most likely culprit. Bad contours from the side leads to a bad look or a bad visual impression from the back view. In order to retain a sense of complexity and keep the work from becoming overly broad, I like to add clay slowly and in small amounts. There are different areas that require different treatments in terms of clay application. And clay application is also something that is somewhat personal. Some places in the sculpture need clay to be added in a broader and faster manner, but for the upper back, for example, we need to creep towards the final borders and adjust as we go. Small amounts of clay added is also a way for me to think my way through the work and develop it as I go and sort of get to see it come to life, if you will. It's sort of like drawing with lighter lines first when drawing, and only once those lighter lines fall into the place you want them to, you commit to them with darker lines. You don't want to commit right away because you're not certain. Small amounts of clay added at a time is sort of the same as that. It's comparable to drawing with light lines in drawing, I suppose. Since we're beginning to more firmly block in the arms here, I should mention some quick proportional shortcuts that we can use, or tricks that I use when it comes to the arms. I use all of these tricks in combination with each other, since on their own there are several pitfalls that can occur, so we want to be careful. So by combining multiple approaches, I hope to stay a bit safer and have less chance of mistakes taking place. First and foremost, we can use a visual approach when determining the proportions of the arms. Let's say we look for where the elbow is in relationship to the body, which we sculpt before the arms, of course. We check where that is on our reference and then place the elbow in the same place on the body on our sculpture, or in relationship to the body, rather. This is a very visual approach, and the problem here is that there is a discrepancy, or there can be a discrepancy between the position of your sculpture and the position of your reference. And if there is, then this method might lead to arms being too long or too short. The reference and the sculpture must be pretty much in the same pose, fairly in the same pose at least, for this visual method to work as it should. We also need to be able to eliminate foreshortening for this to work. But it's always a good place to start, at least, if nothing else, in my opinion. You should also use comparative measurement, however, and make sure that the length of, say, the upper arm corresponds well with some other lengths that are similar to it or in close proximity to it that you've already established. You can, for example, check how many clavicles fit into the length of the upper arm. And again, if you're doing this, be very cautious that you're not relying on, or that you're not observing your work from a place where you're looking at something that's foreshortened, an arm that's foreshortened, or a clavicle that's foreshortened. That can mess things up a little bit. This is not a bulletproof method either, since it builds on something that came before it, which might be wrong. Of course, we're only human, so we'll be making mistakes here left and right. What if the clavicles are the wrong length, for example? Then your arms will be wrong too. However, I think a combination of all of these approaches is needed and should be used to reach a happy medium in terms of deciding on the proportions of the upper arm. Once the upper arm's length have been determined, we can use that length to confirm the length of the forearm. From the top of the shoulder to the elbow should be quite similar to the length from the elbow to the knuckles of the hand. The hand, of course, is often bent at the wrist, so this might lead to some or all of these measurements being a little bit tricky to take, but knowing this will get you into the ballpark, and in combination with all these other methods, comparative and also visual, you should be able to arrive at a decent result, I think. The depths between the forms are getting slowly reduced as we progress here as well. This locks them more and more into place and reduces my ability to make sweeping changes to the internal drawing of the sculpture, which is perfectly fine and exactly what we want as long as I trust the drawing that I've done, of course. The reduction of depth makes the forms more locked in and harder to adjust, but it also makes the sculpture appear more like our reference, and in doing so, it helps us further refine smaller and smaller drawing errors and other issues that do pop up in the work. As I'm reducing the depth between the forms here, I'm also trying to make sure that some of the surfaces that represent the positive forms get smoother and read a bit cleaner as well. This will then differentiate them from the depths between them, between where our transitions are going to go essentially. And I like to have a bit of a finish difference between the two, as it makes it easier to understand and read what I'm looking at. Clarity is always at a premium, as clarity will make it much easier to look at your sculpture and compare it to the reference. It will help you understand what it is that you're looking at when looking at your work. It makes visually comparing sculpture to reference much more low effort, which of course makes it much easier to do.